gantry is pulled back, the emergency vehicle known as the cherry picker is raised into position. All elements of the mission have reported ready to the control center, and the launch is go.
May 1961, Alan Shepard sits in a Mercury capsule atop a converted ICBM rocket, wondering probably, is it all going to work? Indeed, he will go into space, become the first American to go into space, and we're excited to bring that story of how it all came together to you today as part of our History in the First Person program, Building the Mercury Capsule. Hi everybody, I'm Tim Gore, and I'm very happy to welcome you to the James S. McDonald Planetarium here at the St. Louis Science Center. The planetarium is experiencing its 50th anniversary this year, and of course, it's also the 50th anniversary of the end of the Mercury program, a program that began basically in 1957 when McDonald Corporation received its contract to build the Mercury capsule and ended with Gordon Cooper's flight in 1963. Today, you're going to get the chance to meet and interact with some engineers who built and designed that capsule, who worked with the launch systems, and who made it possible for 6 of those 7 Mercury astronauts to go into space. We're really glad you're here. Don't forget, if you're watching on the web or television, you can email us your questions during the program to live@hectv.org. That's live@hectv.org. Let's introduce our panel. We're going to start with the man who's closest to me, Earl Robb. Earl, thanks very much for being here today.
You're welcome.
Give everybody an idea, when did you join McDonald and what did you get to do there?
Well, I graduated from college in 1952 and came immediately to McDonald Aircraft Corporation to work for Mr. James S. McDonald. And I first worked on fighter aircraft, forward fuselage, structural mechanical design on 3 or 4 of the fighter aircraft. And then in 1957 or 58, I was put on the Mercury program, right at the initial start of the configuration conception.
Very cool. Little did you know what might happen then, right?
Right, and it was a great experience, and I've loved it ever since.
Oh, very cool. To his left is Dean Purdy. Dean, thanks for being here. When did you join McDonald?
I joined McDonald in 1955, worked on one Mach 2 jet fighter, and then transferred over to the Mercury program when McDonald received the contract. And then from there went to Gemini and the Manned Orbiting Laboratory, 3 missile programs, and Space Shuttle and Space Station eventually. So
spent a lot of time with space.
Right.
And to his left, Norm Beckel. Norm, thanks very much for being here. When did you join McDonald?
Thanks for having us. I joined McDonald in 1958, February, left Pennsylvania, my home, moving family out here. And at first year I was assigned to the Phantom, which was under competition at that time. And then a year later, I think it was January of '59, we were awarded the contract for Mercury, and the astronautics division was formed, and a team was put together, and I was fortunate enough to be part of that team.
Very cool. We're really looking forward to your expertise today and sharing the stories about what this program was like. I kind of feel lucky because I lived the space program growing up, and now I get to relive it again with you guys during this program, so I'm excited about this. For me, growing up in elementary school, I got the chance to watch all the launches, but for our audiences that are joining us from school groups today, you may very well have never seen a launch from Cape Canaveral. So we're really interested in taking you back to that moment in time. What was it like between 57 and 61? What was the technology like? And that's where we're going to start actually today. Talk a little bit about the technology of the time. So let's go back in time, guys. We're not talking, well, computers existed, but computers certainly weren't like we had today. Norm, your basic computer was like a room size kind of thing?
Yes, and the big difference was they were analog computers, and of course now they're digital. And they did require a lot of room, a lot of power, a lot of air conditioning.
We've got an image of the ENIAC computer, the ENIAC, E-N-I-A-C, the first computer. There it is right there. It took up a whole big room. And all those nice things we're seeing aren't transistors and aren't all the cool things we'd have today. Those are all vacuum tubes, right, Earl?
Yes, they are.
And so we've got an image we can bring up of vacuum tubes to give an audience a chance to see what those look like. Because if you didn't have if you don't have an old television and who knows what else, an old radio or whatever, I'm not quite sure kids today will have ever seen a vacuum tube. But Dean, how did they work? Did a vacuum tube work like a transistor works today, or how did it make its thing happen?
Well, the result coming out of the tube was similar to a transistor,
Okay.
but they worked considerably differently. Yeah.
So, but hopefully they connected correctly to let us get to that point in
Right.
time. And we're talking about not just the fact that computers weren't available in a general sense. You guys weren't using computers for calculations. You guys weren't using computers for design either, right, Norm?
Well, that's true. We didn't have any calculators or computers. Engineers used a slide rule.
Oh,
And,
conveniently mentioned that we actually have yours that came with us today, Norm. Well timed out. In case you've never seen one of these before, and I hadn't seen one since my college days, really honestly, before I began working with this program, describe a little bit, Dean, what did a slide rule do for you?
Well, it does multiplication and division. That's about it. But that's what we used. We didn't have calculators, or we had mechanical adding machines. But we didn't have any calculators like you hold in your hand today and can do all sorts of functions. That was pretty rudimentary.
We've got some footage that we've received from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration and NASA. We thank you very much for a variety of the footage we're going to show in today's program. That gives you an idea about the technology of the time, use of chalkboards, use of vellum drawing paper, and all that shebang. But right here, for example, folks, you're talking about the flight path, you're working on chalkboards. Talk just about the nature of the work, Earl. Like you guys had drawing tables, you used vellum, you didn't use any computer-assisted drafting, right?
No, we did not use any computer-assisted drafting. And yes, we had a drawing board. We did have a drawing T-square kind of machine, and that's what we used. And it was on vellum paper as a start, a preliminary type of configurations. And then we did use linen and mylar for the more durable and scale perfect drawings.
When you're making these calculations and you're using the slide rule, how precise is that kind of work? I mean, we think today like the computer should be able to get it to, I mean, like it should be exactly precise. Norm, is that true, or was there always like a little factor of...
Well, it wasn't as precise as a calculator computer now, but obviously we were able to get it precise enough. And there were techniques with a slide rule that you use like a vernier on it, just like you do on a micrometer or something like that, where you can get your accuracy down pretty good. And one of the things we used is all those logarithm scales on there. And so basically you had a combination of the calculator or the slide rule and a set of tables and sometimes a pad of paper. And but we did space-based equations to put together communication links with the spacecraft, and did it with the slide rule.
Do you think, Dean, that your knowledge of how logarithms really function, how cosine, sine, all that trigonometric stuff works, do you think it helped you guys really think in different ways to make the calculations you needed to, that since it was all brand new?
Well, I think possibly that was the case, yeah. We knew we had to do it, and we figured out a way to do it, and so it worked out in the long run.
What doubts did Americans really have about space travel? And I think that's an important thing for people to understand. I mean, we're talking about a period of time where we really didn't know what was going to happen, right?
Right.
Talk a little bit about that. Describe that. What were fears people had?
Well, people in general were, I think, worried about the need to have a man in space in the first place. Why? Many people were concerned about whether there would be harm to the man. That's basically the way I would answer that.
We weren't necessarily certain how they would respond to weightlessness, or whether they'd come back at the end of the space flight, or whatever the case may be, right? I mean, one of the things that you had to deal with, one of the guidelines of the Mercury program, was to bring the astronaut back.
Right.
But there was no certainty, am I right, that the astronaut would necessarily come back alive?
Yeah.
That's right.
There were a lot of naysayers at that time as to whether man could not only operate but could live through a space environment. There was a lot of discussion as to whether the missiles were ready to put men into space, because we were developing these missiles at the same time and having a lot of failures. the technology. One government employee described after he left the Cape down there, described the spacecraft as a Rube Goldberg arrangement sitting on top of a plumber's nightmare.
Well, that's actually a great example, I think, because the missiles themselves, the converted ICBMs, the Atlas and the Redstones, I mean, would it be accurate to say they failed almost as much as they worked successfully? I mean, they failed a lot, right?
Oh, yeah.
I think, yeah, initially that was the case.
And was
but
it
they became pretty reliable later on.
Right. Obviously, once we got men on top of them, they became exceptionally reliable, but there was some real uncertainty about how effective they would be. And part of what, in case the audience doesn't know, is that the Mercury capsule from the very beginning was designed to be built upon one of those converted ICBMs, that we weren't going to build a new rocket from scratch. We weren't going to use the thrusters we already had. And so that really affected the nature of the design, which we're going to begin to talk about in a little bit. But
Well,
before
there were really only 2 missiles in the whole arsenal that were capable of putting a spacecraft like Mercury into space.
And those were the Atlas and the Redstone?
Atlas and the Redstone.
And what was the basic difference between the two of them?
Well, one was a shorter intermediate range missile, the Redstone, and it had lower thrust. It couldn't put a spacecraft into orbit.
So it was only used for the first 2 flights
First
then?
2 suborbital flights.
Okay.
And then the Atlas, of course, was an intercontinental ballistic missile to start with for the military.
Okay.
And it had the capability of putting a spacecraft into orbit.
A student has noticed, thank you Riley at Lions Creek for this question that we got. He had noticed in some of the preparatory materials that you guys had described using off-the-shelf equipment as part of the program. And so he was wondering, what would be some examples of that? How did you use off-the-shelf stuff?
Well, off the shelf meant that you had to use what currently existed. If it was a systematic thing of a lot of complications, we didn't have time to redesign a new one. So would you basically agree with that?
So like the switches you were using,
Yeah.
like the switches an astronaut would have worked in the capsule, or the same kind of switches
Yeah.
that potentially I could have been using in my home
Yeah.
or at a factory or whatever.
But they
Some
started out that way.
They start, but over time,
But we were operating in a pure oxygen atmosphere, and all those switches had to be sealed. So there were changes even to a standard switch sometimes when we had to have everything sealed in the electrical system.
let's talk about that in a minute. We're going to begin to shift to talk about the capsule, and you mentioned the pure oxygen atmosphere.
Right.
So it was a pure oxygen atmosphere inside the capsule, which you all chose a tremendous potential fire hazard, I'm assuming, because if any little spark goes off in a pure oxygen environment, it's not going to be a pleasant experience. But the Soviets were not using a pure oxygen atmosphere. Did you guys know, how much did you know about what the Soviets were and weren't doing, and were you aware of what their combination of oxygen and nitrogen was or anything like that?
I don't think we knew much at all at that time. Everything was done very secretly. And I think the reason for the oxygen atmosphere was simply waste and simplicity.
Okay.
Weight and simplicity.
Weight and simplicity. 'Cause weight off-
Simplicity and volume. You know, it takes several tanks to put nitrogen and oxygen together and store those in that little small capsule.
And if all I've got is oxygen, then
Yeah.
I've got less to deal with. Let's start to talk about the capsule then. We've got some wonderful footage we've got from NASA, which will give everybody a good overview of the design of the capsule. So let's run that capsule design footage right now.
The Mercury spacecraft, the heart of Project Mercury. 9 feet tall, 6 feet in diameter at the base. Weight over 2 tons at launch. Its shape, design, construction, and function are for a single purpose: to carry a man into space, orbit him around the Earth, and return him safely. The metal used for the basic shell inner wall is titanium with a strength of steel at half its weight. Another high-grade metal, called Rene 41, is used for the outer surface shingles, which are corrugated for stiffness and then bolted to the spacecraft frame. The cylindrical end of the afterbody, covered with beryllium shingles, houses the spacecraft's parachute system. The dish-shaped heat shield, designed to withstand re-entry heat through ablation, consists of several layers of laminated fiberglass resin. The slow melting of this material acts to dissipate re-entry heat. Each development phase of the Mercury spacecraft and its systems was supported by exhaustive testing. The spacecraft had to withstand the combinations of acceleration, heat loads, and aerodynamic forces during launch, re-entry, landing, and recovery. Although a water landing was planned for all Mercury missions, provision had to be made for both water and ground impact. So a landing bag was devised by attaching the heat shield to the spacecraft with a rubberized fiberglass skirt. After the heat shield had done its job during re-entry, it is lowered and the skirt forms an air-filled cushion. Landing impact is absorbed by compression of the air inside the skirt.
So there you have a nice overview of all sorts of different aspects, part of which we'll talk about. Jeremy asked us a question from Lions Creek about the shape of the capsule itself. Where did that shape come from? Is there a specific reason it was designed in that shape, and did it help specifically in some sort of way? So what would you say to that, Dean?
Well, I think the conical blunt body shape that was selected for Mercury was developed originally with Ames Laboratory under an Air Force contract. And they did a lot of scale model testing and proved to themselves anyway that this was the better approach. The Soviets used a spherical shape, but they thought the blunt body shape was the better approach. And it turned out to be that way because Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo all used the blunt body shape. But it was a stable shape, stable design in free fall, and that was very important to them.
Okay. Now the materials were mentioned. I heard they talked about titanium, they talked about beryllium. Were those specifically picked because both their ability to resist heat as well as their weight, they were lighter? Why those particular types of metals?
The answer is yes. The metals that were used were basically all chosen from a structural standpoint to be strength supporting of the structure at the lowest weight. And if you back up in time a little bit, all of us were trained in the aircraft area that the metal you picked for the bulkhead or the stringers it was aluminum because that was the lightest weight. Well, with the capsules that have to endure the heat on re-entry, we had to choose other metals, and they were all alloys.
Okay.
And very strong for the weight.
And that Rene 41 that was mentioned is a particular alloy that came out of some testing that was done as we began to think about these kinds of things. Was that a fairly new development, that Rene 41 patent material?
Yes.
Okay. We've got some footage of the buildings of the space capsule that we'll be showing as we continue this conversation of capsule construction that we may talk about specifically, but you guys can see it as we go on with some of this. This is the McDonnell plant. You guys got the contract in '57, and I think this kind of footage is very interesting, showing the hand labor that you guys were actually doing. It's an important thing, I think, for the kids to understand. It wasn't like there were robots in the factory that were building anything. It was individuals, right, who were building these things, making sure that the rivets stuck into place and all of that kind of stuff. And so you're dealing with hand construction as opposed to continual refabrication, so to speak, as we think about even cars being built today, which is intriguing. Now, what are the different kinds of tests you would do? Like this is dealing something with wiring, I'm assuming, and that kind of stuff. But you guys had to test all the systems throughout the process, right?
Yeah, every system is tested.
Yeah.
Both, it would start with individual component testing at a bench level. It'd be tested inside the spacecraft as systems, and then the whole Mercury system would be put together. And then when you got to the pad, of course, it was tested while it was mated to the missiles. So it was a continuous buildup of testing throughout the program.
People may have noticed footage from the White Room, which is what you're seeing now. Talk a little bit about the White Room. What was the purpose of it? Super clean environment?
Super clean environment, right.
One of the things when you get weightless, if there is anything in that spacecraft, it starts floating around. And so, and it went through a very...
This video gives us a great deal of a nice visual of what was inside the capsule with all that various wire, and we'll talk about instrument panels and some of those few things in a minute. But all of that stuff putting together. The interesting thing is, again, think about its size. That's the real thing, folks. That's not a model you're seeing in that image. So it's a pretty tiny thing, and the astronaut, as you'll see in a little bit when we get to that point of the program, is going to fit in there very tightly and expertly to make sure it all works together. So one of the interesting things about the capsule that we had some advanced questions about deals with its heat shield. The instruments that were used to make sure that the capsule's re-entry in the atmosphere was successful. Thanks, Landon, for that question. Let's talk about the heat shield design. It's based on the concept of ablation, A-B-L-A-T-I-O-N. Let's begin with everybody understanding what ablation is. What is ablation?
It's acceptance of the heat and the burning away and the transition of the heat away from the capsule.
So the heat shield was designed actually to melt away as the capsule was re-entering the atmosphere. Am I right about that,
Right.
Dean?
Yes.
Right.
And so it was made of what kind of material? Fiberglass material?
It was a
Fiberglass,
phenolic resin,
epoxies.
phenolic resin with fiberglass.
And it was how thick to start with? Do you guys remember?
Well, on Mercury, I think it was about 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches thick. Now that was a aluminum honeycomb with the ablative material in layers on that.
We've got some video we can bring up as we continue to talk about this, about the heat shield design and testing. But as it comes back in then, during the re-entry aspect of it, it actually is losing part of itself, right? And
Right.
that's a good thing. We actually want it to lose part of itself so it deflects the heat away from the capsule
Right.
itself.
Just boils away.
Just it boils away, and literally it would. Here we see, and you can tell in the image how the bottom of the capsule is a little bit of a different color. It's been heated up. They're doing a heating experiment of it there, and the computers that are at work to test it and show you what the results of that would be. There was real concern about what re-entry would be like.
Right.
Yes.
And talk a little bit about that from what you did or didn't know about how the human would respond with the G-forces and just the heat and the structure, and what were, Norm, give us a little bit of picture about what was going through your heads as you guys were thinking about that.
Well, as far as the astronauts surviving the G-forces, that was pretty well determined on centrifuges and sled accelerations and things like that. What wasn't known was whether that heat would come around and impinge on the spacecraft. And it was designed, you know, it's like 3,000 degrees temperature coming back on that spacecraft. And one thing is, when you're in that blackout period there, as you call it, this astronaut's on his own then, except for a radar beacon. We could get a radar beacon through, but he's on his own for that 5-minute period when he's...
Right, the ionization that's
Right.
going on as he comes back into the atmosphere, we lose all of that communication. I remember vividly watching the re-entry on TV and that whole 5 minutes of silence or just snap, crackle, pop kind of stuff, and is he going to end up talking to us at the end, and is he going to come through?
Remember the excitement when
Yes,
you heard him?
yes, yes, most definitely. I remember that excitement. We've got a great diagram, Mercury Capsule diagram we can bring up, which gives you a concept of the overall design, shows you the exterior and the interior of the entire thing. And so here we get it in its conical shape. We see the heat shield on the back, the astronaut sitting in there. I'm not quite sure that this drawing is to scale or whatever the case may be, but it gives us an idea of the various things that were all part of that. And one of the things that we're talking about, I see it mentions antenna housing, and obviously we had to have the antenna because you had to keep in radio communication with them.
Right.
But the spacecraft also had to deal with the fact that when it's sitting on the launch pad, it actually had like an escape tower attached to the top of itself, right? In case that capsule needed to be thrusted off the missile, in case the missile decided not to do what the missile was supposed to do. So you had to worry about not just putting the antenna on the end of the capsule, but also how the escape tower would affect the antenna's use.
And it did, in effect. But we were able to maintain communications. The antenna designers did a very good job in being able to have that conical section there both operate in free space and also with that escape tower on there.
Very cool. We've got a capsule. It's hopefully working very effectively, and now we're going to introduce some astronauts into that capsule. We've had a number of questions come to in advance about America's first astronauts, so to speak, the folks that got to go into space before John Glenn and Alan Shepard and Scott Carpenter in that group, and that's the chimpanzees. So Amber, you're going to be the representative for that question I'll ask for you right now. The big general question, and we've got some great footage for everybody to see too, of chimpanzees getting into the capsule and being tested that we can run as we talk about this. But why were chimpanzees sent into space before men? And the second question they ask a lot is, why chimpanzees are not like the Soviets had put a dog into space? You know, why not another creature? So Dean, talk a little bit about our chimp friends.
Well, we had two chimp flights. One was with Ham and one was with Enos. Ham was on a suborbital flight. And they were well trained. They weren't along just for the ride. They had to push buttons, pull levers in response to a light. If they did so properly within the time allotted, they were rewarded with a banana peel. If they did so improperly, they were rewarded with a electrical shock to the bottom of their feet. That was to wake them up and get them back to work. But the one thing that, first of all, one of the objectives of the program was to determine man's ability to function in space, and the chimpanzees were trained to do all of these things. And we used the chimpanzee, quite honestly, because if they didn't survive, we felt it better, I think, to sacrifice the chimp as opposed to a man. But we had a pretty good idea that they were going to do well, and they did very, very well.
So what we learned as a result of them actually doing tasks in the spacecraft while they were up was obviously data that mattered to us, because then we had a sense that obviously a human being should be able to do tasks in space quite successfully.
If the chimp could function, the man can function.
A couple of email questions that have come to us via the homepage web. Don't forget, you can email us at live@hectv.org. Do you guys have any idea what happened to the chimps afterward?
I believe they retired them and led a nice peaceful life.
Yeah,
There was
I think that's
actually down at the Cape there was a whole, I don't know how many, there was a whole facility there for them, and Enos and Ham were selected. I guess they did the best job, and they were selected.
But you might want to point out that they were cantankerous.
Oh, were they
Yes.
cantankerous? I like that word
Yes.
choice.
Like Ham, for example, was very mean after he came back on the flight.
Well,
A bit of a prima donna, is that what you're telling me?
not really. What happened on Ham's flight was the booster engine shut down 2.5 seconds prematurely, and that triggered an abort.
Uh-oh.
And the escape rocket pulled the capsule away from the booster with about a 17 G thrust. That's pretty good thrust, pretty good force. And that would have been fine, except that Ham's apparatus failed during that extreme force. And regardless of how well he was doing, he was being shocked.
Yeah.
And that made him mad.
I can't
And
imagine
so
why
when
that
they-
would bother him at all.
When they opened the hatch, they were confronted with a very, very peeved monkey.
Well, hopefully having a peeved monkey is better than having a peeved astronauts, but you might have peeved astronaut stories that we won't go into now. But let's start talking a little bit about the astronaut itself and making the capsule, the system, astronaut friendly. Probably important for everybody to realize we're dealing with test pilots here. These are all gentlemen who have obviously been test pilots, probably used to being in control, especially in control of their aircraft. And that's not going to happen to the same extent now. So let's talk a little bit about the nature of the capsule and how it was changed a little bit with the astronaut in mind. And one of the examples I know we talked about in advance of the program was the window. It's my understanding there was always a window in the capsule, kind of like a porthole shape, but over time, Norm, that window changed its shape and became more important and easy for the astronauts to use in some way.
Yeah, that was one of the outputs of Shepard. Said, man, we need a bigger window in there. And so subsequent flights had the larger window for them to see.
You also had a periscope as well.
A periscope. So we've got an image that we can bring up which shows you a view of Earth from the capsule window. That gives you, but my understanding is that there were actually like, what, horizon lines or something that were on the window they could line up stuff correctly?
Lines scribed there so they could orient the spacecraft.
So that if the astronaut needed to manually control the spacecraft, they could use the lines on that window to do that with.
Which he did quite a bit.
Okay.
Yes.
They also, of course, had to fit into the capsule. And before we start to talk about all the instruments in, let's talk a little bit about the nature of the capsule and getting in there. You guys described it to me earlier, kind of like the capsule was built around them. There wasn't a lot of extra space, any way, shape, or form. And they each had a couch specifically made for them?
Yes.
Yes.
Talk about that a little bit, Earl. They had a couch that was designed to absorb the G-forces that they would feel?
Yes, to absorb the G-forces, there was some honeycomb for the basic shock level, and then there was foam pads, and they were individually fitted in shape to the astronaut.
Well, luckily
And
enough,
then-
NASA has sent us some footage of that very thing, so we can see what those couches look like. We've got a still image right there. There's the 7 astronauts looking at someone's little couch. I'm not sure which of the lucky guys that one represents. But we've also got some video footage which can talk to you about the astronaut couch creation and let that explain what happened.
Personal, the astronaut support couch. Each of the 7 had his own, molded especially for his body. The design of the contour couch was a feature exclusively developed by NASA for Project Mercury. Its shape enabled a man to withstand up to 20 Gs. Its construction of crushable honeycomb aluminum, bonded to a fiberglass shell and lined with foam rubber, had been well proved by a...
So it fit in there for them. They literally kind of like were, you know, slid into that space quite successfully. And then everything, I mean, once they're into the spacesuit and it's pressurized, they can't move very much. Am I right about that?
That's right.
So what kind of control system did they have? It looks like a joystick when we see the images. Should I think about it? It's similar to like
that's
a
what
fighter
they had.
aircraft joystick would
Yeah.
be?
Yeah.
And then the switches were all like close enough basically for them just to reach out and...
They were about, probably closer than that. They were like 2 feet from their nose to the panel there.
And I'm going to ask you a question that I'll totally understand. How much wire was in that thing?
There was a lot. That's what I said. And the other thing is everything was hardwired then. And if you look at it now, you have all these switches we talked about before. And so I have no idea how many wires were in there, but there were a lot.
And the interesting thing for everybody to realize is it wasn't just a small capsule for the astronauts as they were flying it. It was also a small capsule for you or any of the other technicians who were going to go in and have to check out a system or repair a system, because you also then had to work in that environment and pull off that instrument panel and try to fix it all, right?
That's right.
Actually, only a
Yes,
few
very,
people
very,
were
very
allowed in
difficult.
there. People who could fit in and could still work. And because it was not only in the seat area, but in the conical area where the astronaut could go out that way. And as far as wiring, we had things like coaxial cables too for our radio systems.
We've got an image of the controls. We can bring up an image of controls, which people will get to see the control panel inside the capsule and see what those controls look like, just so you have a sense of that. So all sorts of lovely screens that look like tachometers or speedometers or odometers or whatever I might see inside my car. I'm sure they had different functions than that. But notice the use of the manual switches that you see there, the joystick-like thing, which enable them to manipulate and control it. And they actually had manual controllability, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And we've got some great footage that we can show you of the manual control system right now. Let's run that, and then we'll talk a little bit about that.
Concurrent with spacecraft development was that of major systems, such as the Automatic Stabilization and Control System. The ASCS is essentially an autopilot which instantly senses deviations from the programmed flight attitudes. These are corrected by jets of steam and gaseous oxygen formed by the decomposition of hydrogen peroxide in the thrusters. The jets, released through these thrusters, provide impulses to correct the spacecraft's attitude in pitch, roll, and yaw. Although fully automatic, the pilot can select the fly-by-wire mode and manually control the spacecraft. This mode of control is selected by appropriate switches and effected by a specially developed hand controller.
And of course, they were doing that once they got up into space in a weightless environment, which they would not have experienced. But don't worry, we've got some examples of how they experienced that on Earth. We'll show you in a minute. But they mentioned three terms there I think are important in case students don't understand what they were: pitch, roll, and yaw. So let's define those. What is pitch?
Pitch is up and down.
Okay, and yaw, am I remembering right, is left and right?
Left and right.
And roll literally is...
Yeah.
And so they would obviously have to be able to control the capsule in a roll situation, for sure, right?
Sure.
And to try to manipulate it in those ways. Well, let's see some of the training that they did to be able to do that, some examples of the centrifuge training that they went through, and manual control training. This gives us an idea of what it was like as they tested for weightlessness. I think it's called, what is it, a parabolic flight that the aircraft takes
Right.
that gets you up there to enable you to do the weightlessness training. And they seem to be having a good time as they're rolling around in the environment. And there you see the plane. And for you guys who didn't know, that's how they filmed the weightless scenes in Apollo 13. They went up in the same kind of flight for that. I'm not sure which astronaut this is. I think this is Shepard getting into centrifuge training, if I remember right. But the centrifuge was at Ames, the testing laboratory at Ames. And the goal was to get them to be able to feel what the G-forces were going to be like, so that they could control the systems no matter what was happening with G-forces.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so you'll see here that they're actually trying to do a test or read something back to command if that happened, and then people are monitoring all the medical conditions of the centrifuge. we weren't necessarily sure how many G-forces a man could sustain. Would that be an accurate statement, Dean?
It's true, although there was one Navy pilot, I think, who volunteered for the program that went up to something like 18, 19 Gs in the centrifuge.
And here we are doing some practicing some manual control of the capsule. There you see the idea of the joystick, and here obviously the capsule's in a roll. Mm-hmm. And so can they continue to control the capsule while it's in that roll and making all that successfully happen? Wow. Here's an interesting question that just came up via the homepage. Would the capsule skip off into space if the astronaut waited too long to control it in terms of re-entry? Would it have bounced?
If the pitch angle wasn't correct at the time of retrograde, if it was too shallow, he could skip off the atmosphere and stay in space, yes.
Oh. 2001. Not exactly something I would want to deal with. We also had some email questions come in about the communication system. So let's talk a little bit about the ground tracking network and the communication system that was set up, and we've got some great video to show people the ground tracking network. Describe that, because people need to realize we're not talking about satellites in space at this point. There's not a whole bunch of satellites beaming signals down to Earth. So how was that all set up? What happened?
Oh,
Norm wants to Norm, we're shifting it over to you real fast, Mr. Communications.
Well, that's true. There were no satellite communications, and so all the communications links were on the ground or on ships at sea. And 16 tracking stations were set up around the world, so that there was never, I forget the exact time, but it's like in 7 or 8 minutes time period between one station and another. But we had very good tracks that way. He had voice communications. There were telemetry transmitters on there. There were command receivers in there, so the ground could command things to happen in the spacecraft. And then we had radar tracking with these big FPS 16 radars sending signals up there with a transponder in the spacecraft, so we could locate that spacecraft in space. And actually, when it went through re-entry, we could maintain track on the spacecraft with one of the radar beacons. So we knew that the spacecraft was intact. We didn't know what its condition was, but we knew it was intact.
So you knew it was coming back, you knew it was intact, but you didn't know what the contents would be like or what the astronaut would be like necessarily until they started to talk to you again.
So, and many of these tracking stations around, some of the other astronauts who were not on the flight, they would be manning the stations at these remote sites. But you know, it's all across the Atlantic, across Africa, the Indian Ocean, Australia, and back across the Pacific.
At the beginning of the program, we saw Shepard preparing for liftoff and the liftoff. Let's talk a little bit about launch procedures now before we go into the example we're going to see of John Glenn's flight. Because we've had a number of questions come to us from school groups. Thank you, St. Michael in Illinois. Thank you, Lions Creek in Florida. Thank you, Craig, Alaska, for your questions. Asking about these launch vehicles, they specifically want to know about your jobs, first job, Norm. So during the launches, what is it you were doing?
Well, during the launch, I was in the blockhouse. There was, for every system, there was a panel there.
I'll stop you just a minute, because we've got some pictures of the blockhouse we can bring up as you talk about this. So I'll just let my folks know this while you continue to talk.
Yeah, the blockhouse in those days, like we said before, was all analog systems. So the blockhouse had to be pretty close, within several hundred feet of the gantry, and there you can see the blockhouse.
That's the interior of the blockhouse right there.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, that second guy from the right is me.
Oh, there you go. That's what. Don't look a day older, young man. Do not look a day older whatsoever.
Each system had a engineer in there, and then on the left there are the two, Paul Donnelly and Hal Lujan, are the NASA and the McDonnell communicators.
We've got an image of the blockhouse entrance that we can also show, because this was obviously reinforced concrete that you mentioned, because it was what? For the Redstone rockets, it was about 400 feet away, something like that?
Yeah, something like that.
And then with the Atlases, it ended up being more like 1,200 feet away?
I thought it was closer than that, but maybe not. I don't
know. The worry was, of course, that if the rocket exploded on the launch pad or whatever, you guys would be in trouble.
Right.
So total reinforced concrete there. Now, why, this is an interesting thing for the kids to understand, why did it have to be so close?
Well, because we had to be able to send signals back and forth. And we had to do this over copper wires. And for every foot of copper wire, you lose a certain amount of signal. And so in order to be able to have enough signal at one end, getting to the other end, you were limited in those cable lengths. And so that sort of determined where the space was between the blockhouse.
And there was some sort of umbilical cord that basically connected the launch
There was
gantry?
an umbilical cord, and if they, I don't know if they showed that, but there's an umbilical cord goes into the spacecraft. They pull the gantry away, and you still have communications with the astronaut through the umbilical. And then when you get down to about T-8, something like that, the umbilical is blown away. Then the engines are ignited, and he's on his own then. It's just communications is over the radio
the radio network at that point in time. We did indeed see that when we saw the launch, and we'll see it again when we see Glenn's footage of going up. But let's take a look at how that's all put together. We've got some great video we were able to put together of everything going together. Like here's our launch rocket, here's our capsule going on top of it, the connecting the launch vehicle, the capsule, and everything together up on the launch gantry. So it happens as we speak to this. So how long, generally speaking, gentlemen, did it take for this procedure to happen? Like when we're assuming John Glenn's going to take off, because actually with Glenn's flight, which we're going to see some examples of in a minute, he was delayed multiple times. Remember that?
Oh, yes.
Right, Norm? So like, but Glenn's going to take off, let's say it's December 3rd. What's the time frame as we look at this for the connectivity to happen, and then you're testing all the systems? How far out are we beginning that process?
Well, you start back in St. Louis about 3 or 4 months ahead of time, and then the capsule is shipped down. In the meantime, the missile is shipped out to the pad, and so till you get through your checkout back at the hangar and then get it out there, a couple of months will have gone by. And in Glenn's flight particular, because there was so much concern, we were really cautious on that one. And I don't know, it seemed like we tested and we're out in that blockhouse 24 hours a day for
Talk a little bit, if you can, about
weeks.
the tension level.
Well,
I mean, about being in there and, you know, maybe it's going to work, maybe it's not going to work.
Well, you know, you go through all this here and you're absolutely certain that your system is ready. But when you get down to that final thing, and the capsule communicator says, he goes through every system and he says, calm, and he only wants to hear one word, and that's go. And if he hears anything else, you're in trouble. So when you say go, you say it with a certain amount of trepidation, because the thing flashes through your mind. I've done my just very best. Is everything right? And then when it all goes, then Paul Donnelly and Lujan were on there. They would give a go, and Mercury Control Center would take over, and then they would launch the missile. And it was... Now, Dean, the oxygen came out of the blockhouse.
Dean, you guys would have been doing, you would have tested the systems, you would have gone through like a pre-flight test of all systems before it got shipped off to the Cape, right?
Right,
Yeah.
we did the same thing in St. Louis, perhaps, well, pretty much to the same extent that they would.
Okay.
And that would take, a couple months' time to go through all that. So, and then once we were satisfied that everything was good, we hopefully would ship a good capsule to the Cape. Sometimes they had to do some additional changes to the Cape at that time, so they would pull things apart, and then that all had to be retested and take them a couple months too to go through the same thing. So.
Wow, we got a couple of questions that have come in based on the ground communication network. And the track that the spacecraft would take, was the track basically the same for each flight and mission? Obviously, you know, we're orbiting more and more often as we go up.
Yeah, it is basically the same track. And you went from Glenn, he did three orbits, and ended up with Gordon Cooper, who did, I think, 22 or 24, something like that. He was up over a day. But it just, if you look at it, it's like a sine wave across the Earth's surface.
And they also were interested about how the communication network got established. And you may or may not know anything about that, but just the negotiation process of, you know, Nigeria needs to build something for us, or we need something in Brunei, or whatever the case may be.
I'm sure the diplomatic corps and everybody else got into that.
Well, and I think it's important that kids have a sense about the world then versus the world now. It's the early 1960s, late 1950s, early 1960s. World War II has not been that long ago. America had done a nice thing, saving a good deal of the world, you know, for freedom. I mean, America's relationships with the free world were exceptionally positive at that point in time. And so, plus its power in the world was exceptionally powerful. So who knows how much diplomacy went along versus, we've got some money to give you guys if you want to build a tracking station here in Lagos or whatever the case.
Well, one of the driving forces in this whole thing was the Cold War. we were in a Cold War with the Russians, and they had launched a satellite and a man before we did, and we were bound and determined we were going to put them in the dust, which we did. And but that was the motivation factor, so I'm sure that had a lot to do with where tracking stations went.
Another email question that came in, and Earl, I'll let you deal with this one, talks about the legacy of the German engineers, Werner von Braun, and those good folks who came over,
yes.
The impact they had on the program. How would you gauge their impact and the difference that they truly made?
I can give you an opinion with regard to their activity on space in general. It's hard for me to know their involvement on Mercury. Mm-hmm. But I had the very fortunate chance of meeting Werner von Braun. But this would have been later in the Skylab program. And I met and worked with some of his people that he brought over from Germany. It was a pleasure working with all of them.
Very cool.
Best answer I can give you on that.
It's the answer to the questions. That's absolutely great. Thank you very much. Let's go to some video which is going to summarize a good part of our conversation. We're first of all going to see John Glenn squeezing into his capsule on top of the launch gantry. The sound you're hearing is the natural sound of communication that occurred during this moment in time. Very much a sardine fitting in the can there. And then once he's in that capsule, he's got to do some things to make sure all the systems are operating and go through that. And then, who was you guys told me, Gunther someone was the guy, the last guy?
Gunther Wendt
was the one who would shake his hand at the very end and everything was good to go from that point on?
Somebody described that process as putting them in with a shoehorn and getting them out with a can opener.
I'd say that's pretty accurate. The video we're going to see next gives you a nice overview of John Glenn's flight. In it, you're going to have the chance to see a lot of the things go into play that we've talked about during the program. The launch countdown that they referred to, the takeoff that we've talked about. They're dealing with some manual control options that they had to take care of, that Glenn had to take care of himself in flight, the re-entry process, and then, of course, the splashdown. Look at this, and more questions come to your mind as we begin to summarize everything with this visual example. Send them to us at live@hectv.org. Let's take it away.
Status check, pressurization. Box tanking. Have a blinking high level light. You are go. Water systems, go. Range operations. Clear to launcher. Mercury Capsule, go. All pre-start panel lights are correct. The ready light is on. Eject Mercury umbilical. Oil evacuate. Mercury umbilical clear. Mercury evacuate. Lights on. All recorders too fast. T-minus 18 seconds and counting engine start. May the wee ones be with you, Thomas. Good Lord, ride all the way. Godspeed, John Glenn. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 0. Roger, 0G, and I feel fine. Capsule is turning around. Oh, that view is tremendous. Roger, 7. You have a go. At least 7 orbits. Roger, understand go for at least 7 orbits. We are recommending that the retro package not, I say again, not be jettisoned. This will have to override the 05G switch, which is expected to occur at 044353. This is approximately 4.5 minutes from now. This also means that you will have to retract the scope manually. Do you understand? Roger, understand. I will have to make a manual 05G entry when it occurs and bring the scope in manually. Is that affirmed? That is affirmative. Friendship 7. Amen. 7, this is Cape transmitting blind. Recommend
Suddenly, all contact with John Glenn and Friendship 7 is lost.
Over. This is Friendship 7. I think the pack just let go. Friendship 7, this is Cape. Do you read? This is Friendship 7, a real fireball outside. 7, this is Cape. Transmitting blind. Hello, Cape. Friendship 7, over. 7, this is Cape. Do you read? Over.
The furnace-like heat of re-entry has created a barrier of ionization around Friendship 7, halting all voice communication. The thickening atmosphere breaks his descent, slowing Friendship 7 from 17,500 miles an hour to 1,300 miles an hour in slightly over 3 minutes. And the forces of gravity slam against John Glenn until he weighs 8 times his normal weight.
Keep talking, Al. Friendship 7, this is Cape, over. Friendship 7, this is Cape. How do you read, over? Roger, reading you loud and clear. How you doing? My condition is good, but that was a real fireball, boy. I had great chunks of that retro pack breaking off all the way through. Very good. It did break off. Is that correct? Roger. Altimeter off the peg indicating 80,000. Roger. Re-entry checklist complete. Standing by for me at 10. Roger. Coming down on 10. Snorkels are open. Roger. Main chute is on green. Chute is out in reef condition at 10,800 feet and beautiful chute. Chute looks good.
Home is the Voyager.
Shoot looks beautiful. You can hear the, oh, thank you.
Yeah.
After that whole experience, you can, I'm sure of that process at work. We had a great question come in. You see all those images there of everybody working in mission control. Do you guys remember if any women were involved in the process at all?
I don't think there were. And not in the blockhouse itself.
And do you guys remember McDonnell engineers? Just think in terms, give the kids a little bit of description of the workplace at that point in time. Would there have been women engineers? Or?
Yes.
Yes.
There
Yes,
were
I
some.
worked with.
Yeah,
So you worked with some?
Yes, we did.
Okay, but not necessarily at mission control and that kind of thing. When you guys, when you see that footage, Dean, what comes back for you?
Well, that was a pretty tense time for all of us because we knew that there had been a landing bag deployed indication, and there had to be some pretty quick decisions made. And the decision was to hold that retro pack and to hold the heat shield in place had the landing bag been deployed. So nobody really had tested the ablation, the heat shield. There was some concern about hot spots on it as a result of the retro pack being left on. But doggone thing held together very well. Did its job.
I think that comment about the fireball, I was really scared before that, because I thought maybe the heat shield did come loose. That was really, really bad news. But when he talked about the fireball, I started to realize that's really good news, because we did leave the retro pack on to make sure that the heat shield was still on. So that fireball was the retro pack burning up.
Which was a good thing.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
It's been a great
To me, it
hour,
was.
gentlemen. A great hour. Thanks very much. As we get here to the last minute, 20 seconds, Norman. Impact of the program, your joy, your excitement about being part of it, the impact of the space rate. What would you like to leave the students with today?
Well, I'll tell you, watching that liftoff there, 50 years later, it's still very emotional. It was an awesome experience. It was the first step for mankind.
Dean, what would you add? What would you say?
Well, to me, it was a great honor just to work on the program, and probably the most exciting program that I worked on in my 40-year career.
Earl?
Almost ditto Dean, but I'd put it this way. It was just absolutely terrific. I spent a big chunk of my life on that program, and I loved every minute of it.
And what do you think it meant to the nation?
I don't think the nation really understood the significance, the massive importance of that being the first step in space.
Dean?
Well, we were in this race to space with Russia, and I think that brought us back into the race. They had been ahead of us for some time, and I think we were back in it at that point.
Oh, I think it electrified the nation. John Kennedy and Jackie came down to the Cape shortly after that, along with the Vice President and his wife. And I mean, there were cameras everywhere, ticker tape parades, Life magazine. I mean, it was the most covered event probably in our history, next to the moon.
And that's the way I remember it, that excitement with every launch, with every splashdown. Gentlemen,
everywhere.
Thank you so much for this fantastic hour of time. So glad you're able to join us. We end our program today with the last of the Mercury missions, some footage from Gordon Cooper's splashdown just 6 years after the whole program began.
With Phase 7 hanging from it to be 3 to 4 miles away. USS Kearsarge reports the spacecraft is on the water, as Kearsarge now estimates 700 yards from the spacecraft. 700 yards.
700 yards. I'll be damned.
The helicopters are circling. The swimmers, that is the underwater swimmers, are going into the water. They will have what we call the Stuhlken collar, that is that big yellow rubber ring around the base of the spacecraft.